The 2025 NHL draft is shaping up to be one of the more interesting drafts we've seen in the past few years. There's a lot of really promising players in this draft, but not a ton of slam dunk picks. A lot of question marks surrounding a lot of different guys, and outside of the top two, things can really go in any direction. I've got my post combine mock draft here. I feel pretty good about my top 10. I'm hoping to get a few right, but we're still a long ways out, and really anything can happen in this draft, especially one that's as unpredictable as this one. And then when you add on top of that the fact that, especially in a year like this, we could see some trades within the top 10, there really isn't a pick that feels like a lock in this top 10 draft, especially at this stage where we're still 2 weeks out from the draft. But I have what I think will happen as of June 10th right now. And especially since we're Blackhawks focused, I'm going to go through my top 10 and then really give all the analysis I have on some of the players that the Blackhawks could be picking, especially that kind of core four with Frondell, Denoye, Martone, and Hagens. I'm going to get into those guys as they go off the board in this draft. And obviously, I'm not a pro scout or anything. I've only watched a couple games of these players so far, so I'm just giving my opinions and analysis from what I've seen from them in a limited sample size. I'm going to start off here with the New York Islanders, and I have them selecting Matthew Schaefer. This whole mock draft is what I think will happen, not necessarily what I would do. Though I think if I'm the Islanders, I still would take Matthew Schaefer with the first pick. Obviously, there's a lot of connection with James Hagens being from Long Island, but I ultimately don't think that's going to influence the Islanders nearly enough to make Hagens the pick at number one or even trade down in the draft. Though trading down is a total possibility. We'll see what happens. I hope that happens, but in this draft, I'm not doing any trades. It's just way too complicated. So I have them sticking at one and taking Matthew Schaefer. I think Schaefer paired with Dobson in the future would be really nice for New York. I've seen some Dobson mock trades go around, and I don't really get it. I don't really see why you would trade Dobson just because you select Schaefer. It really doesn't make sense to me. I think if you're the Islanders, you'd love to have a top pair of Schaefer and Dobson for years to come. That'd be one of the better pairs in the league. And everything I've watched of Schaefer is really, really good. He's such a good skater. He's such a good offensive playmaker, but he's good two-way as well. When I watch Schaefer, I see some shades of Zach Werenski. I know some scouts have said Jake Sanderson too, but either way, Schaefer's a very good defenseman. I think if he goes to the Islanders, that'd be a good spot for him. And as of right now, there's no rumors of the Islanders doing anything else but selecting Schaefer with the first pick, and I think it makes all the sense in the world for them. Moving on to second overall with the San Jose Sharks, I have them selecting Michael Misa. Now, I know us Blackhawks fans, if there's any way the Blackhawks can get Misa, I'm in the boat of do what you can. If you can move up, if there's any way to, even if you have to give a pretty decent amount of draft capital, I'm all for moving up and getting Michael Misa. It's very close with him and Schaefer. I think they are 1 and 2, whichever order you put them in. And if you're the Islanders, I still think it makes sense to take Schaefer over Misa, because to find a top pair defenseman or one that projects to be a top pair defenseman, it is harder than finding an elite center or an elite winger. But I really like everything I've seen from Michael Misa. He's plus in about every category. Really good skater, really good top end speed, really good puck skills. His shot is really good. He's also a pretty solid two-way player, which I think is what separates him from some of the players below him in this class. Like if you look at a guy like James Hagens, who might rival him in skill or skating, he doesn't come near his two-way game. And standing at 6'1", the size isn't really a concern as it might be with some other guys down the board. He's got experience at center, experience at wing. I think for whatever team he gets drafted by, you can kind of plug and play him at either one. If he were to go to the Blackhawks, I think he'd be an amazing winger for Connor Bedard. And I think if you are the Blackhawks, you experiment with any way you can get Misa. But in this scenario, I have no trades, and I have the Sharks sticking and picking. And I think if they do pick at number 2, it will be Michael Misa. And if you're San Jose, you're in a really good spot getting Michael Misa. I know they do want Schaefer. They've been linked to trying to move up for Schaefer. But if you can end up with Michael Misa, that's a huge add to the forward group that already has a lot of good players. He's got chemistry in Saginaw with other Sharks top prospect Igor Chernyshев. And then you already have guys like Macklin Celebrini and Will Smith in that San Jose forward group. That's really, really good top 6. So like I said, if the Sharks are picking at 2, I fully expect it to be Misa. Though I will say anything can happen. We've seen Adam Fantilli, who was a projected number 2 pick. He fell to number 3 just a couple years ago. There's really no chalk picks in the NHL draft unless it's like a Connor Bedard situation. But especially in a draft that has a lot of really high potential players, I wouldn't be totally shocked to see this pick not be Misa, but I do think Obviously, more likely than not, this is just going to be Michael Misa here at 2. So if the Blackhawks end up sticking and picking at 3, which is what they're expected to do, they kind of are picking from the tier 2 of forwards, in my opinion. I think Schaefer and Misa are that tier 1 of prospects in this class, and after that, there is a slight drop-off. But I am at number 3 overall for the Blackhawks. I'm going to take who I think they are going to take, and I think that's going to be James Higgins out of Boston College. I know Anton Friendell's kind of been the guy that's been the most linked to the Blackhawks, but I really haven't seen any evidence that would point me towards that they're really feeling good about Friendell. I don't think they've really made that decision yet, and I quite frankly think things are still up in the air, which makes me think that going off how they usually draft, I think James Higgins is going to be the pick. Now with Higgins, the first thing you think of is the size. He's only 5'10 and a half, but I personally think it's getting a little bit overblown at this point. I don't think it would be a reason not to draft him if you value him more than the other players available, which I personally do. Higgins might be the best in the class in terms of puck skills and skating and just that offensive zone game. I'd even argue his skating with the puck is better than Michael Misa. And I think if you kick him out to wing next to Connor Bedard, he's the only guy in this class outside of Misa who's already off the board that could legitimately be a winger for Connor Bedard. So for those who want this draft to be someone that's going to play next to Bedard, I think Higgins is the only guy remaining on the board that can actually do that. And I know Porter Martone's been the attractive name that every fan thinks is just going to slot right into that first wing spot next to Connor Bedard, but I really have a lot of question marks. I think everyone has a lot of question marks with Martone and if he can actually play on a first line in the NHL. And I'll get into Martone a little later when I take him off the board later on in this top 10. But it's undeniable that there's a lot of risk to taking a Martone who, yes, he totally could end up being a first line winger, but there's also a low floor for Martone if he doesn't pan out. And I think the Blackhawks, who have never been afraid to draft size or smaller players, and always love to draft good skating, good skills players, I don't see why they would change that, picking at number 3 in the draft, when Higgins, to me, is the best player available at this point. A little more on Higgins. I think the two-way game is something that definitely will need to be improved for Higgins if he wants to play, especially on a first line or even in a top 6 role in the NHL. But I think with Jeff Blashill coming on as head coach, if you watch any of Jeff Blashill's interviews throughout after he was hired by the Blackhawks, everything he talked about was just implementing two-way game in all the players. He harped on that. Even when he was talking about Connor Bedard, he really stressed on the two-way game and implementing that. And I think the Blackhawks would be confident that he would work that same way with James Higgins and really develop that area of his game. I think that's a lot of what Jeff Blashill has been hired to do. So that makes me feel like they're not necessarily going to rule out a player if their two-way game isn't really that much developed at this point. And I know they have been linked to someone that has a much stronger two-way game in Anton Friendell, but I just don't think Higgins has been ruled out yet at all. And I don't think that the two-way game would be that much of a concern. I think the main question with Higgins would be, is it worth drafting a 5'11 winger in the top 3? And that's a decision they're going to have to weigh over. And if they ultimately determine that it's just not worth drafting, that's why Higgins wouldn't be picked and they would go in a different direction. And if they end up going in a different direction, I think there's still really good players on the board. Like Anton Friendell has a lot of good traits. Caleb Denoye I like even more. And that's someone that projects to be a really, really good two-way center. But them viewing Bedard and Nazar as centers long-term makes me feel like that may not be the direction they go in. So all in all, things are still very much up in the air. I think right now the way I'm feeling is Higgins. I think as we get closer to draft, there's a high likelihood that I would change who I think the Blackhawks are going to pick. But as right now, I'm feeling Higgins. I think he would be, if I'm the GM, I think he would be the player I select, with Caleb Denoye being the close 2. Martone, to me, just has too many concerns. And I wouldn't say I'm sold on Friendell either, but I'm going to end up going with James Higgins here at number 3 to Chicago. And at number 4 with the Utah Mammoth, here's where I have Porter Martone getting off the board. And it seems like Martone's for the Blackhawks is the most popular pick that the fans want. It feels like every fan wants Porter Martone. And I see why. There's a lot to like with Porter Martone. The puck skills, the shot, it's very good. He's a relatively big body at 6'2", or nearly 6'3". And I think if he reaches his ceiling, he could be kind of a guy of what Philip Forsberg is for the Nashville Predators. But to me, I do think Porter Martone is the riskiest player in this tier 2 of forwards. I do have him going to Utah though, because if you look at Utah and their recent picks, they love drafting size. They also already have kind of that top line already figured out, so they're not necessarily relying on Martone to be a top line winger. And I think if he could slot into someone somewhere in that top 6 on that second line, he'd be a really good player for them. He fits their mold of drafting bigger players, and he's also very, very skilled, and I think he can be a really good player. I do think he's being a little bit overrated, especially by Blackhawks fans right now. Like, I don't think he's going to end up being a Tkachuk level player, but if he could even be close to what Philip Forsberg is, I think that's a really good pick for Utah. And if the Blackhawks ended up picking him, I'd be very happy with the pick. There's a lot to like with Pardo Martone. There is just some risk involved with taking him. At number 5 here with the Nashville Predators, I have them taking a bit of a swing and going Brady Martin. Martin's a guy that I think is going to rise up the draft boards and be taken higher than expected by the general population, by the general public. Martin comps his game to Sam Bennett and other guys like Tom Wilson and Matthew Nyes, and I think you see what Sam Bennett's doing in this playoffs, I think teams are going to absolutely love that, and I think he's going to be taken higher than maybe he necessarily should be, but I do have him going in the top 5 just based off his play style, and I think that teams are really going to like this player. Nashville, I've had a hard time finding them linked to anyone. They really haven't put much out there. They did take Martin out to dinner, and we know Utah was very linked to Martin as well, so he could go as high as 4 in this draft. I ultimately went with Martone to Utah, but I do think Brady Martin in the top 5 is totally possible. It is a bit of a riskier pick. There's a chance he might not even be a top 10 pick, but I am going to be a little bit aggressive and take Martin. I don't think he's in consideration for the Blackhawks pick, but I do think he could go higher than expected. At number 6 to Philadelphia, I'm going to be going with one of my favorite players in this top 10, and not one of the Blackhawks Twitter's favorite players, Caleb Denoye. I really, really like Caleb Denoye. I really like what I see. I think he's a very underrated skater. I think he's a really good two-way player, and I think he can be a very good playmaker. He can be physical, and I think going to Philadelphia would be an amazing spot for him. I would love if the Blackhawks end up taking him. I just don't think it's going to pan out that way. And if he went to if he went to Philadelphia, I think that'd be an awesome spot for him. Hear me out when I say this. It could kind of be a Taves and Kane situation in Philadelphia, just not to that kind of scale, where if you have Denoye and Mishkov, Denoye is that two-way center that comps his game, or at least looks up to Jonathan Taves, and then you have Matvei Mishkov, the skilled winger. So I do think there are similarities. I'm not saying that Kid Denoye and Mishkov would be Taves and Kane. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that could be some similarities in the play styles of that top line in Philadelphia if all things pan out. But I really like Denoye. If he ended up going to Philadelphia, I do think it would be a really good spot for him. I do think it makes sense for both sides. And if the Blackhawks ended up with Denoye, I'd be very happy. He's one of my favorite players in this class, and I think he's going to be a very, very good player. I think Blackhawks Twitter, who seem to be very opposed to taking him, I think they need to get in the lab and watch a little bit more of Denoye. I'm obviously no pro scout myself. I haven't watched every game of Denoye, but from what I have seen, he looks like a really, really good player. The Bruins are up at number 7, and I'm actually going to give them Jake O'Brien. Now, O'Brien, I think, could be in some consideration for the Blackhawks pick, even if he's not necessarily in my tier 2 of players, because he's played with a lot of Blackhawks over on Brantford. Marek Vanacker's there, and Nick Lardis, so the Blackhawks have obviously seen a lot of Brantford this year, so that's why I think he could be in consideration for the Blackhawks pick. I ultimately don't think that's the direction they're going to go, though. I have him mocked to Boston because I could totally see him being a Bruin. He just sounds like a Bruin, and honestly, that's pretty much it. I haven't watched a ton of him, so I'm just going to give him to the Boston Bruins. At number 8 now to Seattle, this is where I have Anton Frundell going. Now, Frundell, I think, is the second most likely player to be selected by the Blackhawks as of right now at number 3, but in this scenario, I do have him falling a little bit down to number 8. Now, Frundell has some really, really good traits. His shot is probably the best in the class. Michael Misa might rival that, but if you watch some of his one-time shots, it's absolutely electric. This is definitely someone that projects to be on the first unit power play, but I'm also not really sold on his full game overall. Now, I know some scouts and some people absolutely love Frundell. They're saying he could be the next Kopitar or Barkov. I'm not necessarily there yet, but I do see some of the traits that people are talking about. Corey Proman of The Athletic comped him to Josh Norris, which I think makes a lot more sense. They have some similar traits as well. Josh Norris is a very good player, so I think if that was what Anton Frundell became, I think that he'd be a very good pick, especially here at 8. There are a lot of good traits with Frundell. I'm not necessarily sold on all parts of his game, though he did have a pretty good year, especially at times, though it was rather inconsistent from everything I've read. His skating's just kind of average, and when I watched this game, nothing really blew me away outside of his shot, though he was playing versus grown men as opposed to everyone else we're talking about is playing, or at least most of the guys we're talking about outside of Hagens is playing versus similarly aged competition. So Frondell can totally be a top 6 center from everything I've seen. Again, I haven't watched him enough to really make a full conclusion on what he's going to be, but from everything I've seen, he's a very solid player. I'm just not really sold at him at number 3 to the Blackhawks. I've been falling a little bit down to 8 with the Kraken. Up at number 9 now to Buffalo. Someone that's not going to be on the Blackhawks board is Radim Murtka. He's a big right-handed defenseman, not someone that the Blackhawks would be considering, but I do have him mocked here to Buffalo, who has a plethora of left-handed D, but they're not as deep on the right side. Some of the more recent second-round picks are other big right shot defensemen, but I think Murtka would be probably the best of that bunch. And I think it makes a lot of sense for them to take him. They already have a really good forward group with a lot of good forward prospects. So I think Murtka on the right side would be a really nice addition to their prospect pool. And then rounding out the top 10, I have at 10 to Anaheim, Victor Eklund. Eklund played with Frondell in Sweden. He's a very good skater, good compete, great shot. He is a little bit small, listed at 5'11", 160, which might be some of the concerns, but I think he does play bigger than what he's listed as in terms of his physicality throughout a game. And being a right winger, I think that'd be a nice addition to an Anaheim prospect pool that already kind of has a pretty good top 6, but might be lacking there, especially in a middle 6 right winger. I think Eklund would be a really good pick for them. That's going to round out my top 10 mock draft. Again, it's too early. I don't know enough. I haven't watched enough of these players to be have that big of an opinion, but that's just what I think is going to happen at this stage. I'm going to try to make some more videos that go a little bit more in depth on some of the players at the top end of the draft that the Blackhawks could end up picking. And especially as we get more rumors, more players linked to certain teams, it might give us a little bit better understanding of who the Blackhawks can pick. Because right now, I still do think things are pretty up in the air. Let me know your thoughts on who the Blackhawks are going to pick, who you think they're going to pick, who you want them to pick. And that's going to do it for this video.